Hello everyone and welcome to our video on the theme Speaking Truth to Power in Latin America in the late 20th century. The 1970s in Latin America were characterized by large political instabilities. Most of the region was under oppressive military dictatorships that oftentimes were sponsored by the U.S. in an attempt to stop communism and left-wing movements from spreading globally. Dirty wars fought in Argentina and Mexico resulted in between 9,000 and 30,000 disappeared individuals. At the same time, guerrilla movements and tensions arose. Dictatorial governments took full control, often censoring media outlets that attempted to report on the atrocities committed. They organized frequently to push back against the government. Political unrest, violence, and disappearance of dissidents led to a state of emergency. Women have had an important and powerful role in fighting back against oppressive regimes during this time period. From Las Madres to Comandanta Ramona, female voices have been highly successful in creating political movements and bringing awareness to the global stage. This video will examine the historical context for resistance movements and in particular the important roles of women in fighting against repressive governments and dirty wars. Understanding the theme Speaking Truth to Power is important to contextualize later examples. This theme can be addressed in different ways. Speaking the truth was often difficult and even dangerous under governments that resorted to violence and pressure to unify populations. If the restriction of freedom of expression is the starting point for our reflection, then it is important to analyze who had access to speak up and how power shaped the narratives we have today. Telephones and easy communication were often limited to the upper class due to the financial burden. As a result, new narratives and stories about oppressive regimes continue to emerge as time progresses. Consequently, speaking truth to power comes down to speaking truth to the people, as both the regime and the people claimed their own truth. The government continued to speak its truth to the citizens through television or radio. At the same time, radio broadcasts and campaigns like Vote No in Chile were examples of people speaking their own truth and pushing back against oppression. As the governments were by nature attempting to suppress the truth, the real and raw truth is that of the people in each country. Their work to mobilize through radio, newspapers, protests, marches, and small acts of resistance are all examples of speaking their truth to a larger power system. Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in Argentina are a powerful example of both speaking truth to power and female resistance. In short, the movement of Las Madres started in 1977 when a group of mothers, aunts, wives, grandmothers began to walk in a circle every Thursday in the biggest and most important square of Buenos Aires. They were demanding answers for the disappearance of their relatives who had been taken by the authorities because they were opponents or dissidents of the regime. From 1976 to 1983, there were an estimated 30,000 forced disappearances, which often included the kidnap and murder of any dissident individuals. Las Madres often took to the streets, demanding answers about their children and loved ones. Las Madres were able to create such powerful discourse because they were not seen as a threat initially due to their positionality as older women. By the time that they were in the public view, there was an international pressure on Argentina to both treat the mothers justly but also address their claims. As for today, political messages seem to be transmitted through cultural ways like cinema. The power of the female voice and opinion has translated into different films. Artistic means create malleable and differing ideas of circumstances in Argentina. Many movies have been released on Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, but it is less common to think about the other side. It's important to remember that the government and civil servants had complicated and differing views on these injustices. The movie La Historia Oficial by Luis Puenzo, released in 1985, is a good example of how perceptions of gender have translated to the media. The plot revolves around a judge's wife uncovering the secrets of the Argentinian state. Margaret E. Burchianti explains in her article, Building Bridges of Memory, The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo and the Cultural Politics of Maternal Memories, how the mothers' testimonies have been used by authorities to deny and discredit the regime's violence in Argentina. Movies like La Historia Oficial perpetuate the memory of these events and the people that suffered from them. Nevertheless, Burchianto also highlights that the mother's testimony is still alive, and that the symbols they used are still vibrant and make sense nowadays. Everything is about how narratives are told. Movies can be hugely impactful as they are a social force that shapes social opinion. Historical narratives can preserve Las Madres in their story. To this day, Las Madres are one of the most symbolic groups of resistance. They continue to inspire women to speak out and take action. A second example, in many ways, relates to Las Madres is the femicides and responding protests in Juarez. The 90s were a decade full of crime and violence, especially in the city of Juarez, in which the disappearances and murders of women started popping up more and more. The article, The Role of the Narco-Traffic in the Femicides in the City of Juarez, goes into detail on this phenomenon and its connection to the Cold War and drug business in Latin America. Examining the protests surrounding femicide in Mexico reveal how women mobilize in modern day to injustice. The city of Juarez was considered one of the biggest cities with the biggest number of femicides each year, meaning the biggest number of female murders only because they were women. How did this come to happen? The right-wing governments of Diaz, Echeverria, and Portillo, backed by the United States, were being violent and oppressive in an attempt to extinguish any left-wing movements in Mexico. As women increased their presence in political movements, they became targets for violence. In responses to crimes of the government, guerrillas were formed. They were rebel groups that were oftentimes very violent and opposed the government. Mexico's guerrillas were particularly strong because they were financed by the trafficking of drugs. The femicides caught the interest of Maria Lopez Urbina, a federal officer in the United States. Urbina, together with a female police officer in Juarez, compiled a list of over 80 officials who were thought to have behaved in a negligent way during the investigation of these women's murders. During this whole time, the police kept trying to find and blame a scapegoat for all of these murders, since the situation was starting to gain international attention and they were being pressured to solve these crimes, much like Las Madres. It later came to light that there were in fact many perpetrators. Many were linked to gangs and drug trafficking, and some of them were involved in government itself. The main takeaway from the situation in Juarez is that these families of women who disappeared, who looked internationally for justice and help, very similarly to what happened with Las Madres movement in Argentina a couple decades earlier. Femicide is still a large issue to this day in Mexico, with 3,580 women murdered in 2018 alone. In response, women have rallied to protest murders. In the case of Mariana Lima, a woman murdered by her husband, her parents pushed for answers. While her husband claimed the death had been a suicide, her mother knew of the abuse within their relationship and pursued legal action. Historically, the Mexican Supreme Court ruled in favor of Lima and her parents and arrested the husband on human rights violations. Women have also been crucial in the formation and exhibit titled Feminicidio en Mexico, Ya Basta, in the Museum of Memory and Tolerance. Las Madres in Argentina and the femicides in Mexico outline both ways women increase their political advocacy, but also the repercussions that are possible under a repressive regime. Today, women still have leadership roles in pushing back against oppressive practices. Maybe the most contemporary and famous example is Comandanta Ramona. In 1994, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, EZLN, organized an uprising against the Mexican government over land policies that threatened the livelihood of indigenous communities. Named after Emiliano Zapata, a revolutionary figure who famously advocated agrarian reform in the Ayala Plan, the EZLN continues to advocate for indigenous rights to this day. Comandanta Ramona, on the council for the EZLN, actively incorporated indigenous women into the cause for land rights. In 1997, she gave a speech to the students of UNAM declaring the interest of the EZLN, such as women's rights, indigenous rights, and undoing colonial violence. During intense political instability, women occupied an interesting space as a largely underrepresented group. Comandanta Ramona's language commands unity. She speaks to the students about our ancestors to connect them to the cause. She finishes her speech stating that we will construct a Mexico with all of you. Through her previous language and focus on women, indigenous women knew that this new Mexico would include their voices because of Comandanta Ramona. Young people also felt engaged and listened to as the EZLN frequently reached out to students to garner support. Comandanta Ramona was responsible for the creation of the Revolutionary Women's Law drafted in 1996, which advocated, quote, women's right to self-determination and equality in society at home and in the ranks of the EZLN. Her leadership alone gave the representation to those who had little autonomy and advocacy through her powerful example of female resistance against abuses of power. Her massive popularity, as seen at the variety of protests, indicates shifting attitudes towards leadership. The public and student activists welcome female leadership rather than chafe and resort to male perspectives. Through her visibility and work, we can see how Las Madres paved the way for older women in the political arena, and we can also see how female leadership has shifted to more deliberately include indigenous women in struggles for human rights. Together, Comandanta Ramona, Las Madres, and the responses to femicide reveal how speaking truth to power affected women in Latin America. While each of these movements represents different core sets of issues and values, through the increase of female voices and advocacy, the public has a better understanding of how military regimes affect all citizens. Thank you.